Snow fell like sifted flour over the sleeping town of Ash Hollow, softening the edges of its weary buildings. Lanterns burned low in frosted windows, and the wind carried the faint hum of a hymn from the distant chapel. Beneath that song walked Clara Wren, her shawl clutched tight, her breath silver in the dark. Each step left a fragile print that the storm quickly swallowed, as if even the earth wished to forget her passing. She had once walked these streets with her head held high, before the whispers began. Now, the only sound that followed her was the crunch of snow and the muted laughter of those who thought she could not hear. "She's mending the preacher's linens these days," someone had said that morning in the general store, trying to scrub her name clean. The words burned more than the cold, but Clara had learned to carry the burn quietly. Her cabin stood at the far edge of town, where the river curved like a silver scar through the snowfields. The wind pressed against the door as she entered, stirring the flame in her small hearth. She closed the door, leaned her back against it, and let the silence fold around her like a cloak. In that silence, she unfastened the pendant around her neck. A simple silver trinket, dulled by years of sorrow. She stared at it for a long moment, the metal cold against her palm. "I took it off. Please," she whispered to the room, though there was no one to hear. The pendant had once belonged to Nathaniel, the man who'd promised her a life far from gossip and judgment. But promises made under moonlight seldom survived the sunrise. He'd left her with debts, a shattered reputation, and the ghost of a child she'd never held. Clara opened a small tin box on the table. Inside were a few coins, a torn handkerchief, and a folded letter sealed with a broken wax crest. She placed the pendant atop the letter and closed the lid gently, as if lowering a body into the ground. Then she knelt by the hearth and lifted a loose floorboard. Beneath it shadows waited, the kind that remember everything. She hid the box there and pressed the wood back into place. The wind outside grew harsher, rattling the shutters. Clara drew her shawl tighter and sat by the fire. She stitched a torn sleeve until her eyes blurred, the rhythm of needle and thread steadying her pulse. The church bell tolled in the distance. Midnight. Still, sleep would not come. When the knock came, it startled her so sharply that the needle pricked her finger. Blood bloomed bright against the fabric. She froze, listening. Another knock, low and deliberate. Clara rose slowly and opened the door to a swirl of snow and a man half swallowed by the storm. He was tall, shoulders dusted white, his coat worn but sturdy. A horse stood behind him, its breath steaming in the cold. "Beg pardon," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "My horse's leg caught in the drift. He's bleeding." Clara blinked at him, unsure if she should trust the shape of this stranger. Then she saw the animal's trembling flank and nodded once. "Bring him in." The man guided the horse into the small lean-to beside the cabin. Clara fetched water from the stove, her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. She cleaned the wound in silence while the man held the reins. The lantern light flickered across his face, sharp lines softened by exhaustion, a thin scar tracing his jaw. "You're Rhett Callahan, aren't you?" she asked softly, recognizing him from the distance of church pews and market days. "The rancher who lived west of the ridge," he nodded. "Didn't mean to trouble you this late." "You didn't," she said, though she wasn't sure if it was true. When the wound was bound, Rhett glanced around her humble cabin, the patched curtains, the single chair, the neat rows of folded linen. It was a poor woman's home, but there was gentleness in it too, the kind born of survival. "You should fix that hinge," he murmured, nodding toward the window that groaned with the wind. "I haven't the tools," she replied. Embarrassed, he set down his gloves, crossed the room, and examined the hinge without another word. In a few minutes, he straightened it with a nail from his coat pocket. The window shut cleanly now, the draft gone. Clara stood behind him, unsure what to say. The smallness of the space made every sound intimate. The pop of the fire, the quiet rasp of his breath. When he turned, she saw a glint of something almost tender in his eyes, the kind of kindness that expected nothing. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, then stepped outside to check his horse. By morning, the blizzard had buried the world in white. The tracks leading to her cabin were gone, but the rumor of them had already taken shape in town. At the general store, voices rose like smoke. "Rhett Callahan spent the night at Clara Wren's," Mabel Hart said, her tone half pity, half pleasure. "She's at it again, bless her poor lost soul." By noon, the gossip had reached the church steps. Some men shook their heads, others smirked. No one spoke to Clara when she passed through the square later that day. Their silence stung more than their words. Rhett felt it too. When he stopped by the blacksmith, conversations faltered. The sheriff, old Amos Briggs, warned him gently. "Careful, Callahan. A man's name is as fragile as glass in a place like this. Rhett didn't answer. He simply tipped his hat and walked away. That evening, he rode toward the ridge and chopped extra firewood. When darkness fell, he carried a bundle of it through the snow to Clara's door, leaving it there with a folded wool coat. He didn't knock. When Clara opened the door that morning, she stared at the wood stacked neatly, the coat resting on top. Her throat tightened. She ran her fingers over the fabric, rough, warm, worn by use. She brought it to her face, breathing in the scent of cedar and winter air. "You don't owe me kindness," she whispered, the words trembling like a confession. She folded the coat around her shoulders anyway. For the first time in years, her fire burned bright enough to reach the windows. Days passed. The snow melted a little, only to fall again, softer each time. Life in Ash Hollow resumed its slow rhythm. But Clara noticed small changes. A nod from the postman, a hesitant smile from the butcher's wife. Perhaps kindness, once sparked, could thaw even the coldest gossip. Yet beneath that fragile calm, something deeper stirred. Rhett came by once more, this time with a broken spur that needed mending. Clara knew it was an excuse, but she welcomed it. They spoke little, about the weather, the coming spring, the new colt at his ranch. But beneath their quiet words was an understanding too delicate to name. When he left, the cabin felt warmer than before. She watched him disappear into the white horizon, her breath catching in her throat. That night, she sat by the fire and touched the floorboard beneath her feet, where the pendant lay hidden. For the first time, she didn't feel the urge to unearth it. The silver no longer held her hostage. Outside, the wind had gentled. The sky, once heavy with snow, began to clear, revealing a pale moon. Clara opened the window Rhett had mended and let the cold night air brush her cheeks. The world was still, but not empty. Somewhere beyond the ridge, she imagined Rhett riding home beneath the same sky, carrying his own unspoken thoughts. For now, that was enough. The storm had passed, and though the town still whispered, their voices no longer reached her the same way. Each word was softer, each stare dimmer, as if the winter itself had buried the worst of them. She banked the fire, pulled Rhett's coat tighter around her shoulders, and looked out into the distance. Snowflakes fell slow and silent, tiny, fleeting things that vanished the moment they touched the earth, yet somehow made the world beautiful before they did. In that fragile beauty, Clara found a strange peace, not the kind born of forgetting, but of forgiving herself. And somewhere in the hush of the falling snow, she thought she heard a voice, not Rhett's, not Nathaniel's, but her own, saying quietly, "It's all right to begin again." The wind carried the words away into the night, toward the horizon where another chapter waited, unseen but near. The thaw came slow that year, creeping through the frozen fields like a secret afraid to be known. The snow along the riverbanks began to crack, revealing dark water beneath. Birds returned one by one, uncertain of the season's promise. And for the first time in months, Clara Wren stepped outside without her shawl drawn tight. The air still bit at her cheeks, but the cold no longer owned her. She had begun helping at the schoolhouse, sewing mittens for the children whose parents couldn't afford new ones. Little Ruthie and Eli, whose laughter once echoed beyond her door, would sometimes visit, leaving a trail of muddy footprints and warmth behind. Clara found herself smiling without meaning to. Each day she stitched something small back into her life, a curtain hem, a neighbor's trust, her own voice. Yet peace in Ash Hollow was always fragile, the way a glass window looks whole until you lean too close. One gray afternoon, while she was hanging laundry on the line, a shadow darkened her yard. Sheriff Amos Briggs stood there, hat in hand, his expression heavy with the burden of what he carried. "Clara," he said, voice cautious, "there's been some talk again. Something's come up." Her hands paused midair. "What kind of talk?" He hesitated before producing a worn letter, creased, stained by snowmelt. She recognized the handwriting before he spoke. "Found this in a saddlebag near the ridge. Belonged to a man riding under a false name, Nathaniel." The name fell between them like a stone through thin ice. She felt the blood drain from her face. "I thought he was gone," she whispered. "So did we," said the sheriff. "Seems he's been seen nearby. Some folks think he might have left you with more than just a broken heart. There's a rumor of silver, stolen years back. They wonder if you knew." The accusation, unspoken but present, made her chest tighten. Shame bloomed again, sudden and sharp, as if all her quiet work to rebuild herself had been undone by one careless breath. "I knew nothing of his thieving," she said, her voice steady though her throat trembled. "He took what he wanted and left me with his shadow. That's all he ever gave." Amos sighed, tipping his hat. I believe you, Miss Wren, but belief won't quiet a town. You might need to clear your name once and for all. When he left, she stood in the cold, the letter clutched in her hand. The ink had bled with moisture, the words fading, yet his signature was still there. Nathaniel Pike. Proof of a man who had lived without conscience and left his ruin in her wake. She felt something harden inside her then, something that refused to hide any more. That night, as the wind turned restless, another knock came. She knew it before she opened the door. Rhett Callahan stood there, his coat dusted with snow, his expression solemn. He had heard. The town was small. Words moved faster than mercy. "They're saying your outlaw's back," he said quietly. "They say many things," she replied. He stepped closer, his voice low, roughened by concern. "You don't have to face it alone." Clara's eyes flickered toward the hearth, where the fire burned steady. On the mantel sat the tin box she had unearthed that evening. The pendant gleamed faintly beside the letter, as if daring her to let the past speak. She took a breath. "I took it off." "Please," she said, repeating the words that had haunted her since that winter night. "I thought if I buried it, I could bury him, but ghosts don't stay buried here." She reached for the pendant, her hand trembling. Then she dropped it into the fire. A flash of silver, a hiss, a faint scent of scorched metal. Rhett's gaze didn't waver. "Then let it burn," he murmured. The two of them stood there, the fire reflecting in their eyes. For the first time, Clara didn't feel small beneath the weight of her shame. She felt seen, truly seen, not for her past, but for the courage it took to face it. Outside, the wind rose like a warning. Somewhere far off, a gunshot cracked through the night. Rhett's posture stiffened. He moved to the window, peering into the darkness. "He's here," he said, voice almost a whisper. Clara's pulse quickened. "Nathaniel?" Rhett nodded. "Came down from the ridge tonight. Sheriff's men are tracking him. But if he knows you still live here..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Moments later, the front door burst inward. The outlaw filled the frame, a ghost made flesh, his eyes sunken, his grin a scar. "Well, ain't this cozy?" Nathaniel Pike drawled, revolver glinting in the firelight. "Didn't think you'd keep the home fires burning for me, darling." Clara stepped back, her breath catching. Rhett moved between them, silent, steady as the earth. "You don't belong here," he said. Nathaniel laughed, the sound low and cruel. "That's rich. You, the quiet hero. She always did like her men with rough hands and broken hearts." He turned his gaze on Clara. "Now, where's my silver?" "I don't have it," she said, voice trembling but firm. He took a step closer. "You always were a terrible liar." The silence that followed was thick as the storm outside. The wind howled through the cracks, shaking the lantern. The flames danced higher, casting wild shadows across the walls. Rhett's voice broke the tension, calm and cold. "Leave. Now," Nathaniel's grin faltered. He cocked the hammer of his gun, but before he could aim, Rhett lunged forward. The two men crashed into the table, splintering wood and spilling embers. Clara cried out as the fire licked across the floorboards. "Rhett!" He grappled with Nathaniel, their boots scraping against the floor, breaths ragged. The outlaw struck hard, but Rhett moved with the strength of a man who'd long carried his own grief and refused to lose another piece of it. The gun clattered away, spinning under the stove. Nathaniel stumbled, grabbing for balance, but Clara moved first. She seized the poker from the hearth and swung, not with fury, but with finality. The blow sent Nathaniel sprawling into the snow outside, unconscious, his body half buried in white. Rhett stood panting by the doorway, blood on his knuckles, smoke curling around them both. Sirens of shouts and hooves rose in the distance, Sheriff Briggs and his men closing in. When the lawmen arrived, Nathaniel was bound and taken. No one questioned Clara this time. The sheriff looked at her, at Rhett beside her, and said only, "It's over." But for Clara, something deeper than fear was ending. Something heavier than guilt. She stepped out onto the porch as dawn broke over the ridge, light spilling across the snow. The town stood silent, watching from afar. She could feel their eyes, but for once, she didn't flinch beneath them. Rhett joined her, his coat draped over her shoulders once again. "You're free of him now," he said softly. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with something close to wonder. "I think I've been free longer than I knew." They stood together in the pale morning light. The snow began to melt under their boots, water running in delicate rivulets down the steps. Rhett turned to go, as if afraid to stay longer than he was welcome. But Clara caught his sleeve. "You don't have to go," she whispered. He hesitated, meeting her gaze. For a moment neither spoke. Then without ceremony he took her hand. The gesture was small, almost ordinary. Yet it carried all that had gone unsaid. The quiet understanding, the shared defiance, the promise of gentler days ahead. The sound of the wind softened, carrying the smell of pine and thawing earth. From across the river came the laughter of children, muffled by distance. Life was already moving forward, indifferent to the storms that had come and gone. Clara looked out over the valley, where sunlight touched the snow like forgiveness. For the first time she felt the warmth not as something fleeting, but as something earned. Later, when the town spoke of that winter, they would say that Rhett Callahan made a bold move to save the seamstress from her past. But the truth was quieter. He hadn't saved her. He had simply stood beside her long enough for her to save herself. Years later, an old man's voice might tell the story differently. Some loves don't come like thunder, he would say. They come like snowfall, soft, steady, and gone before you realize the world's been made new. And if you listened closely, you could almost hear the echo of that winter still. Two figures standing on a porch, the firelight fading behind them, the snow melting slow at their feet. If this story reached you, if it brushed against some quiet part of your heart, then don't forget to stay a while and subscribe for more Wild West tales.